Well, thank you again. This time we'll talk about why we are calling this the race to economic emancipation, because that is the theme of this initiative. And I want you to know we don't intend this to simply be an ad hoc celebration, meaning this is not the end, this is the beginning. And we're calling it a race to economic emancipation. Well, you heard me mention earlier that we are in the 150th year of the Emancipation Proclamation. And as I spoke at a church in Detroit this past Sunday, I said, even though we understand that in 1865, when General Granger freed the slaves in Texas and effectively broke the chains off of the ankles of hundreds of thousands of people, how many of you know that today, both black and white or wherever you are, sometimes we have other forms of bondages on us today. Most notably, economic. And this really is about economic independence. And Booker T. Washington said something I think was profound, that at the bottom of education and even at the bottom of politics is economic independence for the Negro. But I think that applies across the board. And so we want to take a serious look at the fact that in every inner city in our country, but starting right here in the state that I live in, the state that I love, the state of Michigan, you look at Detroit, you look at Saginaw, Battle Creek, Pontiac, all of our inner cities, we have a crisis. We have an economic crisis. We have an illiteracy crisis. I saw a report that came from the local government in Detroit that said that 47% of the workforce in this city was functionally illiterate. That's unacceptable. How do we go during the 19th century from dying because we wanted to read? Do you know that many times that a slave who was caught trying to read at a time where it was unlawful lost his life? And we went from dying to read to dying because we cannot read all these years later. We have a problem with high school dropouts. We have a problem. I was reading a report the other day that said that the building trades industry was saying that they didn't have enough qualified workers here to fill the jobs. And yet I look at the unemployment rate, particularly in the black community, and young teenagers have an unemployment rate somewhere around 50%. Now, the Department of Labor might tell you something different, but I submit to you that they don't tell you about the kids that aren't looking for work. They don't count that number in there. So I think those numbers are much higher than what we see in reports. The black unemployment rate and generally is said to be somewhere between 11 and 13%. And there again, I say to you, those numbers are probably higher because, again, they're not counting people who are not looking for work, people who've given up hope. And not just black people who've given up hope, but many Americans have given up hope. So you heard me start off by saying earlier that this is a celebration of American freedom. So I think economic emancipation today applies to all Americans. How many of you agree that we need freedom for all today? How many of you agree that we need limited government in a strong free market society whereby we can have a prosperous economic community where businesses are thriving and families have a better quality of life? That's what we're seeking today. And so we have a number of items that we're going to be talking about throughout this initiative in each city that we tour in so that we can educate. It's really an educational campaign so that we can educate people about some of those issues that we believe that aren't being addressed adequately and that the buy-in citizens have to have in order for those things to take place. One of those issues that we'll be talking about is something called the Davis-Bacon Act. The Davis-Bacon Act, in our estimation, is the lone remaining Jim Crow law in America today. Now, how many of you know what Jim Crow is? Jim Crow, of course, was born out of the black codes, which meant that there were unconstitutional laws or ordinances in local states that discriminated against black Americans. How many of you know the Constitution has always been a pro-freedom document, and that those who would push those kind of laws were always unconstitutional? And so this Jim Crow law, the Davis-Bacon Act, was passed in 1931 because prior to that, you had a lot of black Americans who, in spite of Jim Crow laws, were very creative. And we could do things with our hands and blacksmith, and we worked on roads and constructions. And so many of the black workers, especially from the South, would travel to the northern states. And we would underbid at that time white-only union construction workers for jobs that were being funded by the federal government. And so in 1929 and 1930, right in the House floor, you had senators, Davis and Bacon, who were arguing that they had to do something about Negro labor. And so they passed this bill called the Davis-Bacon Act, which created a threshold which suddenly priced those black workers out of being able to bid and compete in those construction jobs. And interesting, at that time, the disparity between blacks and whites in unemployment was much smaller then than it is now. And so here we are 82 years later. The Jim Crow law of the Davis-Bacon Act, called the Davis-Bacon Act, which again, it has to do with construction jobs that are funded fully or partly by the federal government, is still on the books today. It's still having the same impact, whether intended or unintended, on black workers. But more than that, it's having a harsh impact on American taxpayers. Because what happens with the Davis-Bacon Act is that it's costing American taxpayers anywhere from 10% to 50% to pay for these projects. They're called subsidies. How many of you want more of your money in your pocket? So what we need to do is we need to address this law to have lower taxes. And guess what? If we get rid of the Davis-Bacon Act, that's the difference between having 2 schools or 4 schools. Or you don't like those potholes that you see in your community? Well, you get rid of those Davis-Bacon Act and those kind of policies, maybe we'll have the resources to get those things taken care of. So we need lower taxes. We need a freer society to where people can compete in open merit shops without the government intruding and preventing any American person from working in construction jobs. That is a key solution to economic prosperity and economic independence in our country. And I tell you, as I travel, not many people knew anything about the Davis-Bacon Act. How many of you knew anything about the Davis-Bacon Act before hearing me say something today? Just a few. And so you see, and so we'll be talking about, because building trades, you know, we've heard the president many times talk about shovel-ready jobs, and we do need those jobs, but many times we don't talk about the obstacles to those jobs. So we'll be talking about the obstacles to the people in each of the cities that we're going to, in Detroit and Warren and Jackson and Flint, and educating them as to what they can do about it locally, because locally there's a state policy called prevailing wages, which is the grandson, if you will, of the Davis-Bacon Act. It has the same impact on local projects that are funded by the state of Michigan. We're losing a lot of jobs because the taxes are too high. And so we want to educate people about what's going on so they can know what they have to do about it in terms of holding their elected officials accountable. This is not a Democrat or Republican thing. This is a freedom thing. You agree with that? Yeah. So, and school choice is another issue that we'll be talking about, because how many of you know that the key to American exceptionalism is an educated workforce? Anybody agree with that? Yeah. The key to American exceptionalism, how many of you know that when corporations are looking as to where they want to place jobs, well, the first thing they think about is an educated workforce? So I'll wind this down by saying these are some of the items that we will be discussing throughout this initiative, because we are dealing with economic independence, education, job opportunities, building trades training. We want to educate the people, we want to empower the people, and we want to fight for the people. Thank you. God bless you.